So if there is no God, then of course there cannot be miracles. But the flip side is, if there is a God, if there is a theistic God, okay, if there is a God as the kind of God that theists believe exists, then there's no reason to preclude the possibility of miracles, right? When you think about it, why would it have been wrong? In one case, Jesus turns water into wine at a wedding, right? Okay. In another case, Jesus is given the opportunity to turn stones into bread, and he says, no, we can't do that. Okay. Why would it have been wrong for Jesus to turn the stones to bread, but it wasn't wrong for him to turn the water to wine at a wedding? Hello. Welcome to this class of Persuasive Faith. I'm Rick Harvey, the teacher here in our local church. In this series of lessons, we are exploring the credibility of the Christian faith. If you find this lesson helpful, don't forget to hit the like button, and if you want to make sure you see future lessons, be sure to subscribe. If you would like a copy of the slide notes from this class, there's a link in the description below. Now, today's class. So we are on our lessons on Jesus, questions about Jesus that come up when we're talking to people about the faith. And a couple weeks ago, we looked at just the historical evidence for the real Jesus, how we know there really was a Jesus, and we saw that we have just a great deal of reason to have confidence in the Gospels, at least at a general level, of being a generally historically reliable text. Okay. And we can share that with people and encourage people to have confidence in that, even if they're not really willing yet or able yet to come to a point of confidence in the inerrancy of Scripture. At least they can see that they are generally a historically reliable document. And then last week we talked about the claims that Jesus made. Did he really make the claims to be the Jewish Messiah, the son of David that would sit on David's throne in the Messianic kingdom? And did he really claim to be one with God, the God of Israel, God one with Yahweh? And we saw that he did. We saw that he made a number of implicit claims, and we saw that he made a number of explicit claims that established that. Okay, so then that raises the question, why should we believe him, right? A lot of people out there making a lot of outlandish claims about themselves, right? So why should we believe Jesus? And that brings up the subject of miracles, because the miracles are the credentials that Jesus offered to us to validate his claims, right? So again, our resources, I've mentioned this book before. It's a tremendous resource, Baker's Encyclopedia of Christian Apologetics, and he has a really good section on miracles there. Back in our science module, we did an entire lesson on miracles, and at that time I mentioned Eric Metaxas' book on miracles. He deals in the beginning of the book, he deals some with the questions of just about miracles and are they possible, and the philosophical questions about miracles and that sort of thing. But then he goes on and he recounts the stories of miracles in the lives of people he personally knew or he personally knows. And so that's a tremendous book. Then there is, I've already mentioned in our previous lessons, William Lane Craig's On Guard, and also his book, Reasonable Faith. And then his website, or his vlog, Reasonable Faith, he has a great vlog there on when is it rational to believe in miracles. And then there is Craig Keener's book. Craig Keener, I mentioned him I think again last week, but he's just superb. tremendous researcher, and he has done probably the definitive work on miracles. It's a 2-volume work, and it's just tremendous, in which he deals with all the kinds of questions about miracles. We'll talk about him some today. But he also documents just literally thousands of miracles across the world. Michael Licona is somebody we'll be mentioning when we get into our resurrection module. But in his book, The Resurrection of Jesus, he has a section in which he deals specifically with the question of whether or not miracles are possible. So those are just some of the sources that I'd call your attention to. So when it comes to specifically the miracles of Jesus. So back in our science module, we just dealt with the whole question of miracles and are they possible, and the philosophical questions, the philosophical underpinnings of how people view miracles and that sort of thing. What miracles were, what they're not, those sorts of questions we dealt with. Today I want to deal, we're going to review some of that. We're going to cover some of the same material. But specifically what I'm wanting to deal with today are the miracles of Jesus, those that are recorded in the Gospels that pertain to Jesus. And there are kind of 3 main questions that come to mind when you're talking with people about the miracles of Jesus. And one is, why do you make such a big thing of them? Why are the miracles of Jesus so important to us? Are they really important? Do we really need the miracles in order to have a proper understanding of Jesus and who he is? And then, of course, again, are miracles possible at all? And then the question is, did Jesus really perform the miracles that are attributed to him in the gospel? Do we have reason to believe those? So those are kind of the 3 questions that we want to think about today. So this is kind of a little bit of review of something we talked about in much more in depth back in our science module. But the question is, what is a miracle? And just briefly, what we saw back then, I just kind of want to recap today, that a miracle is an extraordinary event for which there are no natural causal explanations. You cannot explain them through any kind of a natural causation. And they occur in some kind of a particularly religious historical context, okay? So it's an extraordinary event without a natural cause that happens within a particular kind of context. And when we look at miracles in the Bible and how miracles are used and how they're talked about in the Bible, biblically miracles are used or carry with them the idea of a sign. So they are acts of power. They're acts of power that includes some kind of power, some kind of cause that is, as we said, not natural. It doesn't comport with the laws of nature. So it's an act of power that has some kind of significance to it, some kind of sign attached to it, and we see that repeatedly in the Scripture. And then I just mentioned there again, if you want to go back and look at our more substantial study on miracles, it's in your notes. It's lesson 29. If you're looking on YouTube, it's lesson 28. Okay. So there are 2 then key elements to this definition of what a miracle is. And in the first point, it's this extraordinary event that occurs in which there is no natural explanation. The laws of nature, the regularity of nature cannot explain this particular event. So it's extraordinary in that sense. So given the laws of nature, given the natural behavior of things, this event could not have happened or would not have happened, or it's very, 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 very unlikely that this event could have happened given what we know about the laws of nature. So there's no reasonable natural explanation for such an event. Okay? But then in addition to that, the second part has to do with this idea of context. So this supernatural event, this event that happens that cannot be explained by natural means, happens within a particular kind of context, and this again brings up this idea of signs. So the context in which the miracle occurs is what gives it its significance, what communicates whatever it is that the miracle is intended to communicate. So this will be some kind of, I believe it's, Craig calls it a charged religious context. So there's something about the context that makes it religiously charged and gives significance to this event. So that Craig says that a miracle without a context is inherently ambiguous. And so when you think about it, if you take for example the resurrection. If you took the resurrection of Jesus and you just lifted it out of the context in which it happened, it becomes just incredibly ambiguous. So if you don't have the context of the claims that Jesus made, the Jewish environment that he was in, his conflict with the Pharisees, his claims that he would rise from the dead, if you remove all those that religious context and you're just told that this man in first century Palestine rose from the dead, that would be a very ambiguous thing. You go, well, you know, you wouldn't know what to make of it at all. But it's the religious context that gives the resurrection its significance and makes it a miracle. Okay? So the question then is, why did Jesus perform miracles? So in the Gospels, over and over again, we see Jesus performing miracles, and the question is, why did he do them? And I think it's very easy for us when we read the Gospels and we read all these miracles, and usually he's healing somebody, he's doing something for somebody, he's rescuing people in a dangerous situation like on the Sea of Galilee. And we just think, well, Jesus is just, he's loving and kind, and so that's why he does miracles. And certainly that's true. He is doing miracles in order to show his love and kindness to people. But ultimately, his ultimate purpose in doing miracles is the significance of them, right? It's to communicate that he is who he claimed to be, right? So Jesus performed his miracles in order to demonstrate that his claims to be the Messiah and his claims to be divine were true, right? So when you think about it, why would it have been wrong? In one case, Jesus turns water into wine at a wedding, right? Okay. In another case, Jesus is given the opportunity to turn stones into bread, and he says, no, we can't do that. Okay, why would it have been wrong for Jesus to turn the stones to bread, but it wasn't wrong for him to turn the water to wine at a wedding? The reason is because the turning the stones to bread would not have accomplished the purpose for which he did miracles. The purpose for which he did miracles was to validate who he was, right? And of course, doing that by himself out in the desert for his own purposes would not have accomplished that. So, for example, when we talked about this example last week, John the Baptist, of course, is in prison and he's wondering, is Jesus really the Messiah or not? Should we look for another? And so he sends his disciples to Jesus. So it says, now when John heard in prison about the deeds of Christ, he sent word by his disciples and said to him, are you the one who is come, or shall we look for another? And Jesus answered them, go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, and the lame walk. The lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, and the dead are raised up, and the poor have good news preached to them. And in some ways it seems like Jesus isn't really answering their question. But in fact he is answering their question, because Jesus is alluding to the Old Testament prophecies regarding the coming kingdom and the coming king of the coming kingdom, right? So one of the passages that he's apparently alluding to here is in Isaiah 29, where the prophet Isaiah says, in that day the deaf shall hear the words of the book, and out of their gloom and darkness the eyes of the blind shall see. The meek shall obtain fresh joy in the Lord, and the poor among mankind shall exult in the Holy One of Israel. So when Jesus says to the disciples of John, you go back and tell John the things you're seeing, these miracles that you're seeing, and the message that you're hearing, you go back and tell him that, That's the answer to his question. In other words, these miracles are the validation of my claims of who I am. And then, of course, there's the example, I think we also alluded to this last week, the story of the paralytic who's lowered down through the roof. And they lower the paralytic through the roof, and Jesus says to the paralytic, your sins are forgiven you. Okay, it's kind of interesting. He comes there, he wants to be healed, and he gets lowered down there. Instead of Jesus saying you're healed, he says your sins are forgiven you. He might have been going, well, that's cool, but I don't know what he was thinking. But what's interesting then is the people who are around him take offense at that he is claiming to forgive the sins of the paralytic. And so it says, Jesus says to them, he says, which is it easier to say to the paralytic, your sins are forgiven, or to say, rise up, take up your bed and walk? But that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins, he said to the paralytic, I say to you, rise, pick up your bed, and go home. And so Jesus heals the paralytic as evidence or as sign that he is in fact authorized to forgive sins, that he is in fact the Son of Man, as we saw last week. He is divine. So that's the reason why we have in the Gospels for Jesus doing performing the miracles. But then the question, of course, is, are miracles possible? This goes back, of course, to things we talked about in our earlier lesson on miracles, so some of this is review. But remember that that when you're dealing with people, particularly here in the Western world, oftentimes we're dealing with people who are operating from an anti-supernaturalist basis. They do not believe the supernatural happens, and that's because they are naturalists, right? So a naturalist just believes that nature is all there is, or in some cases materialist. There's actually are not synonymous, but they're very closely related. So to the naturalist, to the one who believes that nature is all there is no God. And if there is no God, then there can be no miracles, because by definition a miracle is something that happens supernaturally, or something that happens to which nature cannot be the cause, right? So if there is no God, then of course there cannot be miracles. But the flip side is, if there is a God, if there is a theistic God, okay, if there is a God as the kind of God that theists believe exists, then there's no reason to preclude the possibility of miracles, right? If there is a God, if there is a theistic God who created the world, who created nature, all that sort of thing, then there's really no reason at all to preclude the possibility of miracles. So Craig points this out in his volumes on miracles, and he says, a purely naturalistic paradigm that a priori excludes the possibility of divine causation is not the only interpretive approach to reality by intelligent people in all cultures, nor is it self-evident to observers in all cultures. In other words, what he's saying is, so you've got these two worldviews. One of them is the naturalist worldview that says there is no God and all there is nature, and then you have the theistic worldview. And what he's saying is, there's no reason to accept the naturalistic worldview as if that's the only option. He says there's intelligent people all over the world, in every culture, that reject that worldview and accept rather a worldview in which miracles are possible. So that brings up then the question about the relationship between miracles and natural law. So as we talked about before, the laws of nature are simply a description of the regularity of nature that we observe, right? So the laws of nature are not like civil laws, right? Or criminal laws that we have, where a law is given and everything must do that. The laws of nature, as we understand them, are simply how we quantify, how we measure, and we actually put it into, for example, the law of gravity, we actually put it into a mathematical formula. How we describe what we observe about the regularity of nature. But we have to keep in mind that the laws of nature are based upon our observations of reality. Okay? If a miracle occurred, then our observations of reality have to factor that in, right? So if nature is all there is, then it's reasonable to expect that nothing could occur other than what nature allows, if that's all there is, right? So if nature is all there is, then the laws of nature are supreme, they're sovereign, right? However, if there is a transcendent God beyond nature, who purposely created nature and created nature to operate with a certain regularity, then we would expect, among other things, we would expect that on a regular basis nature would behave in a certain way. Okay, so if God created nature and He created the regularity, we expect nature to operate according to that regularity. But there's no reason to assume that the God who created nature and created the regularity of nature would not at times have reasons why He would not wish to set aside that regularity in order to accomplish some specific or some unusual purpose, right? So take, for example, yourself, okay? So you get up every morning if you go to work, okay? For those of you who still go to work, you get up, you go to work, you have a certain way you drive to work every day, right? You go to work the same way every day, right? Your car is trained. Your car just goes, you're not even thinking, your car just drives you to work. And you've done that every day for years, right? So you have established a regularity. Is there anything that says that tomorrow or the next day when you go to work that you can't divert and go by Walmart and stop in Walmart and pick up something? Of course you can, right? Because you're the one who set the regularity. You're the one who can determine, even though that regularity has purpose, there's a reason why you do things that way. There may be, on given days, a reason to do something differently. The same is true with God. If God established nature and established the regularity of nature, there's no reason to assume, like the deists assume, there's no reason to assume that He couldn't do anything else, that He is bound by that regularity, okay? So what it comes down to then is, if we have sufficient reason to believe in God, as He's traditionally defined, a theistic God, then we have every justification to believe in the occurrence of miracles when we have sufficient evidence to point in that direction, right? So we don't need to accept this very prevalent Western paradigm that nature is all there is, right? So when it comes then to the miracles of Jesus, and I want to zero in on the miracles of Jesus. When it comes to the miracles of Jesus, there are several arguments that people raise against the miracle accounts of Jesus in the Gospels. And Bart Ehrman, who is of course a Jesus scholar, New Testament scholar, he's at least an agnostic. I think by now he actually acknowledges that he's an atheist, but he's articulated these for us. So we'll look at the way he puts them. And his first argument is, well, the Gospels are just not good sources. Okay, the Gospels are just an insufficient source for any evidence for miracles. So that's one of his arguments. We'll come back and look at these. His second argument is that a miraculous explanation for an event would be the most improbable explanation. So whatever happened, any kind of a miraculous understanding of what happened would be the least probable explanation. So no matter what other explanation is out there, no matter how far-fetched your other explanations are, it's better to accept those than to accept the miraculous, because the miraculous would be the most improbable. Then he argues that the conclusion of miraculous occurrences associated with Jesus is a theological conclusion. Okay, and so what he's saying is we can't consider miraculous explanations or miraculous accounts in the Gospels because that's not history. That's a theological conclusion. All right? And so he makes this distinction between theology and history, and he says because these miracle accounts all have theological implications, the historian is not justified in considering them. And this grows out of his fourth objection, which is that in his understanding, what he calls the canons of historical research don't allow for historians to consider miracle claims. So in his understanding, there are these canons of historical research, these kind of rules or principles of historical research that prohibit any consideration of the miraculous or the supernatural. You can only, according to him, you can only consider the natural. And then his fifth argument is, if you're going to accept the miracle claims in the Gospels, then you have to accept all miracle claims. Anybody who claims anything miraculous, you got to accept it because they're as warranted and justified as the claims that are in the New Testament. So, how should we answer these various objections and these various critiques of Ehrman? Well, for one, his claim that the gospel accounts they're just not a good source. In other words, what he's saying, they're not a good historical source. We've just shown that's not true. Okay, we have shown that the Gospels are tremendously reliable historical account of the life of the man Jesus, right? And we've seen also that the miracle accounts are so prolific, they're so pervasive, they are so intertwined that they cannot be separated from the historical, right? So the Gospels are clearly, as we've seen, and we'll see more of this today, the Gospels are clearly solid historical record of things that happened, and the miracle accounts are so interwoven with that history that it's impossible to separate them. So it's impossible to say, okay, I'll accept the Gospels as reliable history, except I won't accept the miracle accounts. You can't separate them. They're too closely intertwined. And so Keener says, so central are miracle reports to the Gospels that one could remove them only if one regarded the Gospels as preserving barely any genuine information about Jesus. So in other words, if you're going to remove the miracle accounts from the Gospels, you've basically taken out all the history that you previously thought was reliable or credible history. And then there's problems with this idea of probability, where he argues, well, miracles are just the most improbable, and so whatever other explanation you come up with, it's got to be better than a miraculous explanation. And one of the problems that entails is that as soon as he brings the question of probabilities into play, he is introducing, or he's bringing into play, Bayes' theorem. Okay, so we've got to go back to Bayes' theorem again. So we talked about this way back many lessons ago. So it's that kind of mathematical looking formula, right, by which probability theorists, the method by which they weigh out competing hypotheses, competing explanations, to figure out which one is the most probable. So if you're trying to figure out what's the most probable, a miraculous explanation of the evidence that we see in the Gospels, or some kind of natural explanation, in order to figure out which is the most probable, you need to use Bayes' theorem. Okay? And one of the things that Bayes' theorem requires is it requires us to consider what is the background information. What background information do we have besides just the evidence at hand? Okay? And as I pointed out already, one of the background pieces of information that has to be factored into Bayes' theorem when you're considering the miracles of Jesus, one of the pieces of background information you have to factor in is the likelihood of the existence of God. Okay? And as soon as you factor that in, that changes the equation. So in Ehrman's mind, there is no God, or there probably is no God. So since there probably is no God or is no God, then miracles can't happen. So then certainly it becomes the most improbable. But as soon as you factor in the probability of God, that changes the equation. Okay? And he completely ignores that. And then there's another problem, is that with with Ehrman, what he's doing is he's equating frequency with probability, okay? And that's actually a logical mistake. Frequency and probability are not the same thing. So just because something seldom happens or only happens once doesn't mean it's improbable, right? So throughout history, we see all kinds of things throughout history that only happened once, right? That's what makes them historical events, right? They only happened once. And yet, they're not particularly improbable. We don't go, well, gee, that, you know, I just don't see how that could have happened, right? There's just all kinds of things in history that happen only once and yet are completely probable. So frequency and probability are not inextricably linked together. They are two distinct things. So just the fact that miracles are rare does not make them improbable or unlikely. So just because a miracle is rare or miracles are rare doesn't mean that when I'm considering a particular claim of a miracle I should dismiss it because I know miracles are rare. Well, we'll grant miracles are rare. That's what makes miracles miracles, right? They are an exception to that rule, that regularity of nature. So we readily accept that. Miracles would not be miracles. They wouldn't communicate anything if they weren't rare, right? If they happened every day, they wouldn't communicate anything. And then on this point about making conclusions, historical conclusions about historical or about miraculous claims, he's confusing historical conclusions that somebody might make with the theological implications. So to use an example not related to history but related to science, we now know, as of about the 1920s or whatever, we now know from scientific evidence, right, that the cosmos had a beginning. We have scientific evidence or proof of that, right? But we also know that for a number of decades after that, in fact, even today, some people are refusing to accept that the cosmos had a beginning, right, because of its theological implications. All right? So they're saying, I'm not going to accept the universe had a beginning, even though we have all this evidence now of, that we've talked about in our science module that the cosmos had a beginning. Even though we have all that evidence, they say, well, I'm not going to believe that. I can't believe that. That can't be true because it has the theological implications that there is a God. Right? Well, people want to do the same thing with history. They want to say, well, I'm just not going to accept all this evidence for a miraculous occurrence because if I accept that, that has implications, theological implications. And basically what Ehrman is doing here is he's saying, I can't accept any miraculous claims because they have theological implications. Okay. But there's nothing about history that tells us that we can only believe that things happened in history if they don't have theological implications. Those are the only things we can believe actually happened in history, are the things that didn't have theological implications, right? That's just an irrational argument, right? And that again comes back to this whole idea of the historical canons. Are there historical canons that say that you cannot consider anything with theological implications that you have evidence for in history? And there just simply there are no canons like that, okay? There's nothing inherent in the study of history that says that you cannot consider something that happened as having happened if it has some kind of implication that it was miraculous. There are no canons like that. So again, going back to Keener, he says, from the conventional historiographic standpoint, the issue for the Gospels and Acts is simply whether the eyewitnesses can claim such events. So that's what he's saying. He says, from a historical perspective, the only question we need to ask is, can people claim they saw such events? And he's saying, well, of course they can claim that. Okay? Whether or not they're true or not, that's another issue. But he said, there's nothing that says that we can't consider that people claimed such events, all right? Rather than resolving the nature of the causation. So I can acknowledge that something happened for which I have no natural explanation. I can acknowledge it happened without resolving the question of what caused it. Okay? So the historian is free to do that. He's free to say, this happened. I have all kinds of historical evidence this happened, without necessarily him having to make some kind of resolution as to what caused that. He's completely free to do that. And then on this claim, this ridiculous claim that if you believe one miracle claim, you've got to believe all miracle claims, it's just silly, right? We have, in the first place, we have no reason to insist that God can only do miracles for Christians, right? God can do miracles for people who aren't Christians. Keener's book has a number of documented miracle claims in for people who at the time it happened were not Christians, okay? So there's no reason to believe that miracles can only happen for Christians. So if somebody who's not a Christian says they witnessed a miracle, I shouldn't necessarily preclude it or believe it based on the fact that they're not a Christian, all right? In addition to that, if in fact there are other non-material beings, such as demons and that sort of thing, there's always the possibility of supernatural events being done by other non-material beings. But even more basic than that is the issue that just not all miracle claims are equal in credibility, right? It's just ludicrous to say that I have to believe all miracle claims. I choose to believe, and we'll talk about this in a minute, I'll choose to believe the miracle claims that meet certain standards, and I choose to reject the miracle claims that don't meet those standards, okay? So that raises the question then of what constitutes evidence for a miracle. And a common claim you'll hear people give, and I just heard that, I forget what the context was, but I just heard it used just within the last few days. I heard somebody use this claim. And the claim is that an extraordinary event calls for extraordinary evidence, right? So the idea behind that is miracles are so extraordinary that I'm going to have some kind of just really extraordinary evidence before I'll believe the miracle happened. And when you first hear that, it almost sounds reasonable, but it's not. Okay? You don't need extraordinary evidence to establish a miracle occurred. But even beyond that, the question is, what do they mean? So if somebody says that to you, well, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, you can ask them, well, what exactly do you have in mind? What extraordinary evidence would convince you that this was a miracle? Right? And usually at that point they start groping. And what they end up asking for a lot of times is another miracle. They want a miracle to validate the miracle, right? So what's most likely meant then, as I have there in your notes, what's most likely meant by this is there's got to be some kind of extraordinary amount of evidence, or there's got to be some extraordinary kind of evidence before I would believe in a miracle. But what is really necessary if I want to know that a miracle happened, if I want to justify that a miracle happened, what do I need to do to establish that? And actually it's pretty simple. Okay, it's going to sound confusing when I say it. We've gone through this before, so maybe the second time through it you'll get it more clearly. But just simply, it's more likely, okay, so this is what's required, it's just that it be more likely that the evidence we possess regarding an event would exist if the miraculous event occurred than that same evidence would exist if a miraculous event did not occur. So what do I mean by that? So let's say you possess a certain amount of information, a certain amount of what we call data or evidence. So you know, for example, that congenital blindness is incurable. You know, that people in your day and age, first century Palestine, people born blind are never cured. It's never happened, it doesn't happen. This is again the regularity of nature, right? Okay? And And you also know, you've encountered an individual who you know is congenitally blind. His parents say he was born blind. Okay? And you also know, this is all the evidence you have, right? This is all the data you have, the information you have. You also know that this man encountered Jesus, and Jesus commanded him to see. You have all this data, you have all this evidence. And in addition to that, you have the evidence that he can now see. Okay? So this is your data, this is your evidence. So what do you need to establish that a miracle occurred, right? So the data you possess is the incurability of congenital disease, that there's a man who was congenitally blind, that he encountered Jesus, Jesus commanded him to be healed, he then immediately began to be able to see, that sort of thing. So the question is it more probable that a miracle explains that data than that there is some kind of natural explanation that explains that data? So what would be your natural explanation for all of that evidence that you have, right? And all you need to know whether a miracle happened is that it's more likely a miracle occurred, that's the better explanation that really accounts for all the data, than that some kind of natural event happened, okay? So sure, you could argue, well, the guy, he fell out of a tree and he knocked his head and he could see. That could be your explanation, right? Okay. The problem with that explanation, of course, is completely ad hoc. You have no evidence that he fell out of a tree, right? That's not in your data. That's not in your evidence, and you have no reason to believe that would, in fact, be a cause of blindness, usually of healing. It's usually a cause of blindness rather than the other way around, okay? So all you really need to do to establish a miracle is that the probability of number one is greater than the probability of number two. In other words, all you need to do to establish that a miracle occurred, or at least to believe that a miracle is a more probable explanation than some kind of natural explanation, is that the data that you have is better explained by a miracle than it is by some natural explanation. That's all you need. It doesn't have to be extraordinary. It doesn't have to be another miracle. You don't have to have thousands and thousands of pieces of data or information. That's all you need. Okay? So then that brings us to what kind of criteria should we use in identifying a miracle? And the first is, well, what about the evidence that we have? Is the evidence that we have reliable or credible evidence? And there again, we don't need to put any kind of extra stringent requirement on the evidence. So the evidence just needs to be as good as the evidence that we would accept for anything else that we would accept, okay? So we just, if you know that congenital blindness is incurable, what's your evidence for that? Well, your evidence for that again is the regularity of nature. We've never known anybody to be healed of congenital blindness, okay? And so that's a piece of evidence, and that piece of evidence is roughly equivalent to the pieces of the evidence that you would accept for any number of things, right? That you have a man who's congenitally born blind, his parents tell him he's blind, you accept his parents' testimony that he was born blind, okay? Are you generally in the habit of accepting the testimony of parents, unless you have some reason? So the point is, the evidence that you have, do you have sufficient reason to believe the evidence? And all you need to do is have for the credibility of that evidence to be as reliable as the credibility for anything else you would believe in that type of a situation, in that time and place. And then the second criteria is there is little or no evidence that one or more natural agents could have produced the evidence. So I've got the evidence, I've got this whole body of evidence, there's really no natural explanation for this body of evidence. So we'll get into this when we get into our module on the resurrection, right? We have a body of evidence, concerning the resurrection. We'll go over that. But the various explanations that you get to discount the resurrection, the various explanations you get, will usually try to account for one or two pieces of evidence, but they don't account for all of it. Okay? They don't account for the testimony of the women, the empty tomb, the conversion of Paul, and all these other evidences that we have, right? So is there a failure of natural explanation to explain the totality of the evidence that I have? And then, is there some kind of justification for a supernatural interpretation? This is the context issue. So in other words, did this miracle, is the evidence I have, is it reliable evidence? Can I trust the evidence? Is there any natural explanation for that evidence? If there's no natural explanation for the evidence, and if this happened in a particular context, Jesus of Nazareth, who claims the authority to forgive sins, heals a man of his paralysis, that's the context. And when I see that, when I see a man who in this religious context heals a man of his paralysis, I go, that's a miracle. That's a supernatural divine act. Okay? So, when it comes to defending miracles then, when we're dealing with people, excuse me, we don't need to prove that miracles happen. You don't need to prove in some kind of absolute sense that miracles happen. All you need to do is show that a miraculous explanation is the most probable explanation, the most reasonable explanation, right? Given the failure of natural explanation to account for the evidence that you have. Well, it turns out then, excuse me, that, as I've said, people object to miracles because either they've never seen a miracle or they think miracles never happen. So, for example, we talked about the Scottish philosopher David Hume, who argued that miracles run counter to universal human experience. What he was saying is nobody ever seen or experienced a miracle, right? And what Keener demonstrates in his book, and one of the reasons I loved reading his book, it got a little tedious after a while because he just goes through one miracle after another, literally thousands of them in a two-volume book. He just goes through hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miracles, and after a while they get boring. Okay? And the point is that Craig has established that throughout history and around the world there are just millions of accounts of miraculous events. Okay? This runs completely counter to what, of course, Hume claimed. And so when I say around, throughout time and around the world, this includes the modern era. So it's not just that miracles happened sometime in the ancient past, but miracles have happened in what we think of as the modern era, the scientific era, and even up to today, right? And not only are they happening in the modern era, but they oftentimes, and he documents these, they include contemporary medical documentation and the testimony of Western doctors as to them having occurred. Okay, so they're not just something that just barbaric people off in the ancient past believed happened, but we actually see them happening in the modern era and even up to today. And not only do they happen up into the modern era, but they happen all over the world. So they don't just happen in what Craig or Keener calls the majority world, the non-Western world. They don't just happen in the non-Western world, they also happen in the Western world, okay? So they're happening all over the world, all around the world, and he has documentation from all over the world. So even in the West, where we have this really strong anti-supernatural bias against miracles, Keener has demonstrated miracles happen. Okay, now we don't have as frequent of a record of miracles in the West. We talked about some reasons for that in our previous lesson on miracles, but we still have many documented miracles in the West. And though it is true that miracles are, within Christian environment, miracles are more prevalent in what we might think of as Pentecostal or charismatic environments, they are not exclusive to Pentecostals and charismatics. That many non-charismatics, non-Pentecostal Christians, both Protestants and Catholics, recognize and report miracle occurrences. Okay? So we have this widespread then account of miracles all over the world and throughout history. So what all of this does then is finally it has begun to cause a ground shift with historians on how historians view the miracles of Jesus. So you remember we talked in a previous lesson, we talked about the quest for the historical Jesus, and the idea of the quest for the historical Jesus was to find the historical Jesus sans miracles. So the quest for the historical Jesus back in the 19th century was to try to find the real Jesus and without all the miracles. And what we saw about the quest for the historical Jesus, it finally petered out. And the reason it petered out was because they couldn't separate the miracle accounts from the actual history. They were too intertwined, right? And historians have now recognized that. So historians today are increasingly accepting the New Testament miracle accounts as being in some way at least historically authentic. All right? So one reason for that is when they look at the historical records, the enemies of the Christians and the enemies of Christ, none of them attempted to discount the miracles. Right? You would think that if they wanted to discount Jesus as what he claimed to be, the first thing they would try to do is say the miracles didn't happen. But they don't do that. They attribute them to demonic activity or whatever, but they don't deny the miracles happen. And so today now, more and more historians are coming to this kind of growing consensus that Jesus was a miracle worker. And so Keener lists a number of non-Christians, in some cases Jews, in some cases Jewish scholars, in some cases atheists or agnostic scholars, who acknowledge that Jesus was a miracle worker. So he says most scholars today working on the subject thus accept the claim that Jesus was a healer and an exorcist. And then a little bit later he says, it is thus not surprising that most scholars publishing historical research about Jesus today grant that Jesus was a miracle worker, regardless of their varying philosophical assumptions about divine activity in miracle claims. So even among historians and unbelieving historians, non-Christian historians, there's this growing consensus that Jesus was in fact a miracle worker. Now they've got to figure out how to deal with that coming from their philosophical point of view, whether they're Jews or whatever, but nevertheless this is the trend within history. So that one leading Christian skeptic of Christianity, John Muir, says that Jesus as a miracle worker has as much historical corroboration as almost any other statement we can make about the Jesus of history. And so we can have tremendous confidence that Jesus who claimed to be the Messiah, the Jesus who claimed to be divine, and the Jesus who said the miracles were the evidence of that, did in fact perform many, many miracles and exorcisms. So just quickly then reviewing what we've talked about today, a miracle then is an extraordinary event for which there is no reasonable natural explanation and which occurs in some kind of a special religious context that points to divine activity. Okay? If there is a theistic God, then miracles are possible. Only a naturalistic worldview precludes the possibility of miracles. As we just saw, most historians today studying and publishing about Jesus accept that Jesus was a miracle. And we saw that that miracles play a central role and a non-negotiable role in establishing the credentials of Jesus. And so Jesus did in fact perform miracles. He performed healing miracles, which demonstrated his authority over disease and death. He performed nature miracles like stilling the wind and that sort of thing, which demonstrated his authority over nature and the cosmos. He performed exorcism, which demonstrated his authority over the spiritual realm. And, of course, his greatest miracle was resurrection, which demonstrated his authority over sin and death. So that's Jesus and miracles. And that brings us then to the last question we want to deal with in our module on the life and death of Christ. And that is the question of how did Jesus die? And why is it important that he died the way he died? In other words, it's important to us as Christians not merely that Jesus died, but it's also important to us as Christians that he died by crucifixion. Okay? And so that's what we want to look at next week. And you might wonder, well, why do we need to talk about this in apologetics class? And it's quite simple because there are many people who deny these things. They deny that Jesus died by crucifixion. And particularly if you have any Muslim friends, they're very adamant in denying that Jesus died by crucifixion. So we want to be able to establish not only that he died by crucifixion at the hand of Pontius Pilate, but we want to understand why that particular kind of death is essential to our faith. Okay? So that's where we're going next week. Okay? Any questions? Okay. See you all next week. Happy 4th of July.